no one in the village of Adankra could remember a time before Kessi. That was the strange thing about him. He seemed to have always been there, yet no one could say with certainty when he had arrived, or from where, or in whose arms he had come. The oldest woman in the village, a leathery creature named Ya Sarpong, who claimed to have seen 93 harvests, swore that Kessi had been found at the edge of the river, with the cord still wet around his wrist. But no one else remembered this. And Ye Sarpong, it was quietly acknowledged, sometimes confused the past with her dreams. What everyone agreed upon was the mark. It ran along the inside of his left forearm, from the crook of his elbow to the heel of his palm, a discoloration unlike anything the village healer had seen in her decades of practice. It was not a scar from fire or blade. It was not the bruise of rope or the branding of iron. It existed beneath the skin like a shadow pressed from the inside, a whirling, branching shape that some said resembled a river viewed from a great height, and others said looked like a tree stripped of its bark, and still others insisted was a language written in characters too old for anyone living to read. The slave traders who had brought Kessi to Adankra at the age of perhaps 7 or 8 had charged less for him than they would for a goat. They had said nothing about the mark, only glanced at it and looked away with the manner of men who had learned not to ask certain questions. Otu, the compound head who purchased Kessi, had asked them twice where the boy was from. The first time, they pretended not to hear. The second time, the older of the 2 traders had answered with a single word, a word that no one present could later recall, only that the sound of it made the air feel briefly colder. Kessi himself, when asked, said nothing. Not because he was mute. He had a voice, low and careful as water finding a path through stone, but because he seemed to possess no answer. He did not know where he was from. He did not know who had born him. He knew his name because it was the only word he had spoken when the traders first produced him from the back of their cart, blinking in the daylight. Kessi. Whether it was the name his mother had given him or the name some stranger had fixed to him, no one could say. The first year, nothing happened that could be called unusual. Kessi worked. He was quiet and quick, and learned the rhythms of the compound without needing instruction. He rose before anyone else and slept after everyone had retired. He carried water, mended fences, sat with the smaller children in the evenings, and listened to stories he never told himself. The mark, however, grew, slowly at first, so slowly that Otu's wife, Abina, who noticed these things, thought perhaps she was imagining it. But by the time Kessi had been in the compound 8 months, the branching shape had extended past his wrist and begun tracing its way across the back of his hand like roots seeking moisture. It did not seem to pain him. When Abina asked about it directly, tilting his arm toward the light with a bold frankness that startled him, Kessi simply watched it with her, as if the mark belonged to someone else and he was merely its custodian. "Does it itch?" Abina asked. "Sometimes," he said, "when the rains are coming." She looked at him. "Before or after?" He looked back at her. "Before." Abina was not a superstitious woman. She had little patience for the village's elaborate ecology of spirits and omens and ancestral displeasure. But she told Otu that evening that they should take the boy to the fetish priest, and she was not in the habit of making suggestions she did not mean seriously. The fetish priest, a man of enormous calm named Nana Boafo, examined the mark for a long time without speaking. He turned Kesi's arm in the light. He pressed his thumb against the discoloration. He brought his face close enough that Kessie could feel the old man's breath against his skin. Finally, Nana Boafo straightened, and Otu asked what it was. "I don't know," Nana Boafo said. Otu laughed, assuming this was the beginning of a longer statement, but Nana Boafo said nothing more. He handed Kessie a dried seed on a cord and told him to wear it. And then he dismissed them all with the air of a man who had encountered something that had placed itself outside his jurisdiction. By Kessie's second year, the compound had begun to organize itself quietly around certain facts. The first fact was that animals behaved strangely in his presence. Not dangerously. No livestock fled him, no dogs snapped. It was subtler than that. The goats would stop whatever they were doing and watch him when he passed. The chickens parted around him with an odd deliberateness, as if they were stepping around something that occupied the same space as Kessie, but was not Kessie. The compound's old dog, a grey-muzzled creature who had long ago lost interest in everything, would follow Kessie from a distance of exactly 10 paces, never closer, never farther, until Kessie entered the sleeping quarters, at which point the dog would sit at the threshold for a moment and then return to its spot beneath the mango tree. The second fact was that things did not rot near Kessie. This was noticed first by one of Otu's daughters, who had left a cut yam outside the storage room and found it still firm 3 days later when it should have been black with flies. The next time, she did it on purpose. Left fruit, then fish, then a bowl of palm soup. With Kessie sleeping on his mat a short distance away, and with the same food left an equivalent distance on the other side of the compound as a comparison. The results were consistent, she told her mother. Her mother told no one else, and told her daughter the same. The third fact was harder to describe, and therefore harder to discuss. It had to do with dreams. People who slept near Kessie reported vivid, coherent dreams of places none of them had ever seen. Coastlines of foreign configuration, cities with architecture that belonged to no civilization the dreamers recognized, mountains that seemed to float above clouds rather than rise from earth. The dreams were not frightening. They were, if anything, strangely peaceful, but they left the dreamers with a sense of having visited somewhere they would never return to, a feeling that was both loss and completion. One of the young men, Kwame, who slept in the same room as Kessie, began to request reassignment to a different sleeping arrangement. Not because he feared the dreams, he explained with some difficulty, but because they were making the waking world feel thin. In Kessie's third year, the river failed, not catastrophically, not in the manner of a drought or a flood, but in a way that was harder to reason with. The fish stopped coming. The nets came up empty. The traps sat for days and held nothing. The river itself ran clear and seemingly healthy. Its level unchanged, its current unaltered, no visible event to account for the absence. But the fish had simply gone somewhere that was not Adankra. This had never happened before. The oldest members of the community compared notes and agreed. Not in their lifetimes, not in the lifetimes of their parents, not in any story passed to them, had the river's fish abandoned Adankra. The village's food supply was not immediately threatened. They had other sources. But the fishing community that formed the backbone of Adankra's trade with neighboring villages was devastated. Debts accrued, relationships soured. It was not Kessie who first became the subject of suspicion. It was a man named Asare, a fisherman who had lost more than most, who began to make the connection aloud. He did it carefully at first, in the manner of someone testing the temperature of water before stepping in. He mentioned, in various conversations, that the trouble had begun in Casey's time, that the mark on the boy was not a natural thing, that Nana Poafo's refusal to name what he had seen was itself an answer. The village did not rush to agree. Adankra had its share of cruelty, but also its share of sense, and its sense knew that Asari was a man who needed explanations for his suffering more urgently than he needed accurate ones. Still, the seed of the idea landed in soil that had been made soft by 3 years of unease, and it found purchase. What saved Kessie, at least temporarily, was Abena. She stood in the compound's common space one afternoon when the mood had grown heavy and the looks directed at Kessie had begun to sharpen, and she spoke in the tone she used when she had already finished considering something and did not intend to reconsider it. She said that she had lived with this boy for 3 years. She said she had watched him work without complaint, care for children not his own, sit with the dying when everyone else found reasons to be elsewhere. She said that the mark on his arm had been there since before he arrived in Adankra, and that if the river wished to explain itself, it was welcome to do so, but that in the absence of an explanation from the river, she did not intend to make a child its scapegoat. There was a silence after she finished, not the silence of agreement, but the silence of people adjusting their weight from one foot to the other, deciding how much they wanted this particular confrontation. Asari left. The others dispersed. The conversation did not end, but it moved underground, where it continued at reduced temperature for the remaining months of the drought. The fish returned in the 4th month of their absence, as suddenly and inexplicably as they had left. The nets came up heavy, the traps were full. The celebration in Adankra was genuine and collective, and for a time the anxiety around Kessie receded like a tide. But it was during this season of relief that the mark completed itself. Abena saw it first. She came upon Kessie at the water's edge at dawn, his shirt off against the heat, and the mark had extended from his left hand, which it had covered entirely, across his chest to the sternum, and down his right arm to the elbow. In the early light, it looked almost luminous, a blue-black tracery that moved with his breathing and made him look, she thought, like a map of something she could not name. Not a river, not a tree, something older than both, or perhaps something that contained both, that contained all the names humans had given to the patterns of growth and flow and reaching. She did not call out to him. He did not turn to face her. She stood at the edge of his awareness and looked at the mark in the early light, and she felt for the first time in her unsuperstitious life that she was in the presence of something that had not originated in any world she had access to. That night, Kessie came to her. He stood at the entrance to the cooking area where she was working by the light of a small fire, and he said, with the careful, measured quality his voice always carried, that he needed to tell her something. She set down what she was doing. She did not ask him to sit, sensing that he would speak better standing. He said he did not know what the mark was. He had never known. But he said that sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, he heard something. Not a voice exactly, not a sound precisely, but a presence that felt like a question being asked in a language he had never learned and yet could almost understand. The presence felt very old. It felt, he said after a long pause, like grief. Not his grief. Someone else's grief that had been placed on him, packed around him the way water is packed around a seed to keep it alive during a long journey. Abina watched him. "Who placed it?" she asked. "I think," he said slowly, "someone who loved me very much, or someone who loved something I carry, and could not go where I was going. They see, village healer, an old woman named Akosua Mensah, had avoided Kesi until his 4th year in Adankra. This was not indifference. It was the professional caution of someone who had spent her life learning to diagnose what she could treat, and had made a policy of not studying what she couldn't. But in his 4th year she sought him out. She found him in the field, and she asked, with the directness of someone who had given up on pleasantries decades ago, if she could look at the mark. He extended his arm without hesitation. She looked at it for a long time. She had traveled, more than most people in Adankra knew, and she had studied with healers in 3 other regions before returning home. She had seen many things. She had seen skin conditions that mimicked spiritual affliction and spiritual conditions that mimicked skin diseases, and she had long since learned to keep the 2 categories separate. What she said to Kesi was this. She had seen something like this mark once, before, 30 years ago, on a woman brought through a coastal town during the trafficking season. The woman had been old, ancient in fact, a woman of such age that her continued living seemed like a decision rather than a biological fact. The mark on that woman had been different in its pattern, but identical in its quality. That deep beneath the skin quality, that sense of something impressed from the inside. The traders handling the old woman had been afraid of her, which Akosua Mensah had found interesting, because traders and human beings did not usually permit themselves visible fear. "What happened to her?" Kesi asked. "She died at the coast," Akosua said. "She went to the water's edge and sat down and did not get up again. People said she was waiting for something. People said the sea came up a little higher than it should have when she died. I cannot verify that. I was not there." "Do you think the mark killed her?" Akosua Mensah looked at him with the expression she, with reserved for questions she had already thought about at length. "No," she said. "I think the mark kept her alive. And I think when she reached the coast, the thing the mark had been carrying her toward was finished, so she could stop." They sat with that for a while. "What is the mark carrying me toward?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. This was the same answer Nana Boafo had given, but it sounded different from her. Not a refusal, but a genuine reckoning with the limits of knowledge. "But I think when you arrive, you will know. And I think," she added, standing to leave, "that it is not necessarily a terrible thing." In the year that Kesi turned what the compound estimated was his 16th, a stranger arrived in Adankra. She was an old woman traveling without companions, which was unusual. She walked with a staff and carried a cloth bag, worn soft with age. She asked for water, which was given. She asked if anyone in the village bore a mark they had not made, and in the ripple of unease that followed the question, someone pointed without meaning to toward the compound where Kesi worked. She found him by the same water's edge where Abina had seen him years before, and she sat down beside him the way you sit beside someone you have been looking for across a very great distance, with relief and with the exhaustion that relief produces. She spoke to him in a language Kesi should not have known. He understood it anyway. What she told him took a long time, and no one was present to hear it, and Kesi himself, when asked later, offered only fragments. But the shape of what he shared was this. The mark was not a curse. It had never been a curse. It was an inheritance, a burden of memory from a lineage that had been severed by the violence of captivity and transit, the kind of severance that leaves some piece of the ancestral weight untethered, floating, latching onto whatever living soul carries the bloodline forward. His mother had carried it, her mother, before her. Before that, the trail went back to a woman who had made a choice, or had a choice made in her name, that set this particular grief in motion, this particular cargo of remembrance, this particular need for a living vessel. "What does it want?" Casey asked her. "To be known," the old woman said, "to have a witness. The dead do not rest easily when no living person knows what they carried. You are the knowing. You carry it so it is not lost." "But I don't know what they carried," Casey said. "I don't know their names. I don't know what happened to them." The old woman looked at the mark on his arm, and then looked at him with an expression that was the saddest, and also, in some way, the most tender he had ever encountered. "You know it," she said, placing her hand briefly over the mark. "Here, you don't have words for it, but you know it. The body knows what the mind has no language for. That is enough. That has always been enough." She was gone before morning. No one had seen her arrive from any particular direction. No one saw her leave. The footprints she left near the water's edge did not extend in either direction for more than a few paces, which Ashare, who had long since made his peace with Casey, if not with the strangeness that surrounded him, pointed out with the tone of someone who had stopped expecting explanations to arrive in any conventional form. Casey did not leave Adankra. This surprised some who had expected the old woman's visit to resolve something in a more dramatic fashion. A departure, a transformation, some visible proof of completion. But Casey stayed. He continued to work. He continued to speak carefully and listen carefully and sit with the dying when they needed company and with the newborns when their mothers needed rest. The mark did not fade. If anything, it settled into his skin more deeply, as though it had been restless before and was restless no longer. Abina, who made it her practice to look at it every few months, noted that the branching had stopped. It had reached what it had been reaching for. Not a place, she understood eventually, but an acknowledgement. A moment of being seen. Years later, when Casey was a man of middle age and the children who had grown up in the compound had children of their own. One of those children, a sharp-eyed girl named Adwoa, who asked questions the way other children breathed, sat beside him one afternoon and asked about the mark. He showed it to her. She traced it with her finger without touching the skin, following the branching paths the way you follow a river on a map. "What is it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is everyone who came before me, who needed to be remembered and had no one to do the remembering. It is the names that were taken, the languages that were interrupted, the choices that were not choices. It is all of that, carried in the only place they could put it, which was the body of the one who lived." Adwoa looked at it. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes," he said. The same answer he had given Abina decades before. "When the rains are coming." "Before or after?" "Before." He looked at her with something that was neither sorrow nor peace, but the particular expression of someone who has found a way to hold both at once. Always before. The body knows what is coming before the mind does. That is what it was always trying to tell me. The curse no one could explain was not a curse at all. It was love, surviving in the only form that survived.